They're so enjoying themselves. I cannot get them back. I know. They're enjoying themselves too much. Hey, this happens all the time. I'm used to it. It's okay. Everybody's enjoying themselves. That's great. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So, I've been at this. I realized that this is like session number 24, and I've been. This is probably the longest teaching I have ever done on Shaul, on Apostle Paul. I usually don't teach on him. I usually teach on other things, but this is probably the longest one I've ever done. So I'm kind of out of my element here. Unity and diversity. Some of you probably still remember what my mysterious image on the screen means, right? Yes, you remember that? Yeah, you've been here most of it. Plato's cave, that's right. Plato's cave, the allegory of the Plato's cave. That sometimes we just don't see things as they are. And for some of you, the study of Romans that we've been doing together has been kind of like an experience of Plato's cave, because some of you grew up listening to teachings from the books of Romans, and I had to flip a few of them upside down for you. I'm going to continue doing that kind of sort of a little bit more today. Sorry, I'm not done yet. So we got into chapter 14 last time, and that was a bit of a confusing context. I realized what I've done is I didn't really give you on the front end what I think it means. And some of you really wanted me to tell you what it means. But in kind of me stringing you along and letting you figure things out on yourself, I left a lot of things unsaid, which caused more questions that I could imagine. So that's okay. We will tie this all together. The problem with this is the fact that Shaul's thoughts are very long. Sometimes his thought stretches out for about a chapter and a half, sometimes even more than that. And so I can't just land the plane like that easily in a short session. So let's recap very quickly. In the previous session, we started to unpack Shaul's teaching in Romans chapter 14. We talked about the meaning of his teaching. We talked about, we considered whether this teaching has something to do with Jewish lifestyle. We considered whether it has anything to do with Jewish diet or not. We wondered, like, what is this all about? Why? Because the teaching is not a simple one, okay? It's kind of complicated and stretches on for quite a while. Now, we did not make it all the way through the chapter, not surprised, because there's so much packed into it. We had to cut the conversation short, but now we can continue. Now we can pick up exactly where we left off, so I'm trying to remind you where we stopped last time. Shaul is clearly upset about people judging and putting people down, putting each other down, and apparently the context of people in Rome putting each other down, somehow that context is tied to food. And that's what makes everyone turn to that entire chapter and make it about food. But remember, one of the things that I highlighted for you is that what Shaul is most upset about is how people are treating each other, not what they're eating. He actually doesn't care that much about what they're eating. He cares much more about how they're treating each other. So we'll unravel a little bit more. So food. Food is an obstacle. And it is an obstacle to good relationships. And apparently in Rome that's what happened. So this is the context, of course. And we're used to food being an obstacle, especially in settings where Jews and Gentiles are involved. Okay, where there are two different cultures that practice food differently, that treat food differently. What's food for one is not food for another. Okay, so we're used to that. But my question to you, and that was the question I asked last time, are you sure that that's what Romans 14 is about? Are there really any Jews at all involved in anything that is being said in Romans 14? And you have to read it in context, and you have to be insightful. And I want you to note that Shaul's point actually has not changed. Whatever he talks about in chapter 14, it's still the same. He says, do not judge. Even when the food is the matter about which people are quarreling, even when food is at the core of the disagreement, his overarching idea is still, don't judge each other. Stop being difficult. So this is what he writes. Chapter 14, verses 13 through 15. Therefore, let's not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this. Do not put an obstacle or stumbling block in a brother's or sister's way. I know that I'm convinced in Master Yeshua that nothing is unclean of itself, but to the one who thinks something is unclean, to that person it is unclean. For if because of food your brother or sister is hurt, you are no longer walking in accordance with love. Do not destroy with your choice of food that person for whom the Messiah died. So obviously it is somewhat about food, because the food does come up here. But do you hear Shaul's passion? What is he upset about? He's upset about people getting on each other's case, mistreating each other. Yes, food is the crux of the matter, but there's something here much more. So he talks about putting stumbling blocks in front of people, and that should be familiar. So he talks about not destroying with our choice of food this relationship. And then in verse 14, that's the troubling one. That's the one that everyone turns on. He says, nothing is unclean in itself. This is where we get really stuck on. So let's get the first things out of order. The prohibition of setting stumbling blocks. That's a quotation straight from the Torah. Some of you who study the Torah love Leviticus. You would know that one. Leviticus 19, right? It says, do not put a stumbling block in front of the person who can't see. That's just cruel. Why would you do that to them? Don't be like that. Don't be a cruel person like that. And that's a common sense commandment, but guess what? It made it into the Torah. So that makes sense to most of us. We get it. We understand. Then Shaul says something that's really puzzling and sometimes even shocking. I know that I'm convinced in Master Yeshua that nothing is unclean in itself. But to the one who thinks that something is unclean, to that person, it is unclean. Now, what kind of teaching is that? This is weird. This is strange. Now, traditionally, this statement is taken to mean that Shaul does not think that biblical categories of clean and unclean, which are spelled out in Leviticus chapter 11 in the Torah, are valid. Traditionally, if you pick up a commentary on this passage in the book of Romans, and you read, and that's what it's going to say. See, Shaul says, clean, not clean, who cares? None of it matters. It's all the same. That's what all the commentaries are pretty much going to say. They're going to say it in different words. They might say it more sophisticated, but that's what they're going to get to. So how else can one interpret this statement that just says, nothing is unclean of itself? Like, how can you undo that one? Well, Greek and Hebrew, by the way, helps a lot. Okay, I'll tell you this. There's always a secret. When in doubt, look into the original. Because translations, they can go one way, they can go another way. There's so much subjectivity in our translations. We translate things all the time. And sometimes we just kind of go with what feels like right to us. Why? Because we are the translators. We have the right to do that. But the original can't change that. So we always got to look at that. So why is this topic, why is this statement so shocking? Because any one of you who knows Torah understands that that's absurd to say that nothing is unclean. Come on. You read the book of Leviticus. It's all about all these different things that are unclean. How many times is the word unclean is used in the Torah? And then you're going to tell me nothing is unclean? Well, yeah, if you're going to buy this idea of canceling the entire book of Leviticus and just throwing it in the garbage and saying, there you go, that's what people are going to suggest to you Shaul is doing. But that's not it. So I guess we'll unravel this mystery.
That is part of what confused me all of my life growing up as in the Christian church, whether it was the Catholic or the whatever. Sure. There was just so much inconsistency. It was like, wait a minute, but I'm reading this in Leviticus, but then I read this here, and you're trying to tell me this, and it really brought confusion. So
Good.
Thank you for clarifying.
We'll clear it up. We'll clear it up. There is a way to understand this.
Now, but
right, I get it. But there's a way to understand. There's a lot of people still trying to work through this. So for the benefit of everyone, whether you figure this out or you're still trying to figure this out, this is a puzzle. Because Shaul does say that nothing is unclean of itself. But the one who thinks that something is unclean, to that person it's unclean. It sounds very relative. Like, it sounds very relativistic. If you think it is bad, then it is bad. But if you don't think it is bad, then go ahead and do it. It's okay. Like, how can you talk about anything that's black and white or sinful or right or wrong like that? Well, you can't. Like, if you think it's wrong, don't do it. But that's, well, yeah, but that's how people think about commandments and God and Torah and all these different things. And so this is a dangerous line of thinking. If that's how you're going to apply to this particular commandment, you're going to be able to apply that same logic to other commandments. You know, adultery, if it is wrong, then it's wrong. But if you don't think it's wrong, then go ahead and do it. It's not wrong. And let me replace it with another commandment. And on and on and on. You get the idea. This is a pretty terrible slope. So nothing is unclean of itself. He says that, and it's shocking, and we don't get it, we don't understand it. Like, what can you possibly mean by that? So, all right, let's unravel this a little bit. Sorry, little Hebrew lesson, little Greek lesson here. In Hebrew, clean is tahor, and unclean is tameh. These are familiar words to you. If you've been studying passages in the Torah, you have come across them. Okay, the Greek equivalents to these terms, because we're reading Shaul in Greek, okay, is katharos and akathartos. Akathartos, it would be unclean, okay? So those are the Greek equivalents there. But these are not the terms that are used in this verse. Isn't that interesting? Once I start looking into the original, it says nothing is unclean, and he uses the word koinan. Nothing is unclean in itself. But to the one who thinks that something is unclean, again, koinan, to that person it is unclean, koinan. See, that's a different word, right? I just told you that unclean is akathartos. And what in the world is this koinan? What is this koinos? Well, koinos means common. It means impure in a sense of defilement or contamination. In Hebrew, equivalent to this word is chol, which means ordinary, as in non-sanctified. This is the antonym of the word holy. This is another category of clean and unclean, essentially, that people do not always go into. But if you read Leviticus, of course you do all the time, because in Leviticus, there's things that are clean, there are things that are unclean, but then there's also things that are holy and things that are common. And that's the category that most people that don't study the temple or don't really care about the temple, it's lost on them because it doesn't exist. Why? Because they have no application in their daily life to that. And that's what I mean by it. Yes, Jake.
So essentially, chol, to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but like if you were in the middle of the wilderness and you happened upon like an apple tree, for example, it hasn't been part of the Levitical system of the Orlah, and it hasn't been necessarily sanctified in any way. The apple is not, it won't contaminate you, it's not unkosher, it's a kosher food, but it hasn't been, it doesn't have a ritual or sanctified status.
Right. It has no ritual. Now, by the way, I love your example. Good luck finding an apple tree in the middle of the wilderness. But I love your example. It still counts. We do all deal in hypotheticals all the time. So yes, you find an apple in the middle of the wandering in the wilderness. It has not been sanctified. Why? Because the law of the Orlah has not been applied. Number one, you do not know how old this tree is. Number two, it has not been tithed. If it's not tithed, its fruits are not kodesh. They're not holy. They're not susceptible to be an offering before God. You can eat it, but it's just not holy. Now, is it unclean? Yes, it is unclean. And to certain people, it would be absolutely unclean. To a priest, it would be unclean. Absolutely. They could not eat it because the priests are only to eat what is kodesh. They cannot eat anything else. But to an average person, maybe it's okay. So, again, these are the categories that we're getting into. This is a little bit different than if you don't understand Leviticus, you're going to be stuck. Yes?
But I guess furthermore, like at Havdalah, for example, we say that God, Hamavdil bin Kodesh Tahor,
Right.
That which is holy versus, he creates a distinction between that which is holy and that which is ordinary or
Thank you.
secular.
It's a perfect example. Shabbat is holy. Thursday is ordinary. Okay?
That's not the same as bad.
It doesn't mean that Thursday is unclean. or dirty or bad is just not holy. Not like Shabbat. Shabbat is holy. That's what's different. David, you had something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, if I find an apple tree in the wilderness, I want to assume it's a miracle, and it's very sanctified.
Thank you. That's what I thought. I love Drake's example, like apple tree in the wilderness. We're all into that, yes.
You might get into this, but I'm curious because the idea of clean and unclean within a Gentile community, how did that get there?
Thank you. You got a rabbi talking to a bunch of Gentiles, right? So please understand, people live under this idea that Shaul is going to teach Torah to a bunch of Romans in the same way that he would teach Torah to a bunch of Jews. Now you assume that Romans 14 is to the Jews. Remember, I told you Shaul keeps jumping audiences all the time. Sometimes he talks to Jews, other times he talks to Gentiles. Then he talks to both of them. Then he turns to the other audience and does it again. And his context switches all the time depending on what he says, depending on his message. And you have to read very intuitively to kind of see the shift. He doesn't tell you. You just have to know. So if he's teaching Torah and he's quoting Torah, who is he talking to? We don't know. We really have to read. But the kinds of things that he's talking about is giving me a really wild guess. I have a clue that has been given to me because of what he says. He says, if that person thinks that something is unclean, to that person is unclean. I don't have to think if something is clean or unclean. I know because God told me. I don't need to wonder. I don't need to guess. I just know, okay, this is not acceptable, this is acceptable. But to a person to whom this teaching was not given, they don't have that same guidance. They don't even have that obligation. And because they don't have that obligation, they are in this category where they can decide. And whatever they decide, by the way, will be okay. Because while Israel has these conditions that were bound upon us by the covenant, and we said, yes, we will do it, standing at the foot of the mountain, the rest of the world did not stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and say, Lord, whatever you tell us, we will do. That did not happen. So I want you to realize that the rest of humanity is not bound by the same set of rules. So
So he's talking to like God-fearing people who are trying to come into this, who are trying to decide which level they're going to go
right.
to.
And that's where the question comes in. If it's okay to you, it's okay. If it's not okay to you, it's not okay. You have to follow your conscience because you walk with God. As you walk with God, listen to what the Spirit is telling you and follow your consciousness. And that's why the answer that he gives you is a very wishy-washy answer. If it's okay, it's okay. If it's not okay, it's not okay. That's not a Torah answer. It's not an answer in this clear category of conditions. He's talking to this blurry middle, okay? This situation where people are not quite 100% sure what to do.
Well, I do think that if you're talking about people out in Gentile spaces where idolatry is like super prevalent, then making something kosher is both a matter of like making sure that abide by certain rules, but also supply chain management, make sure that it maintains status as it goes through and gets to your house. And so if you have all this stuff that's of unknown quantity, is it involved in idol worship, and you are in a space where you're doing your own conscious is doing risk management. Can I eat this or can I not? And people are making different decisions. And the greater question is like, well, none of us have supply chain management out here, and you can't get this. Here, make your decisions and above all, prioritize love.
Exactly. Thank you. That's a good recap. That's a good way of looking at it. You've just brought something out that I was actually going to go into
I'm sorry.
a little bit. But it's okay. Don't worry. You can always jump the gun on me. No big deal.
Sorry.
That's all right. So I have a feeling you read this before.
No, never.
That's okay. You're doing just fine. So here we are in Romans 14:14, that notorious verse that makes no sense. And why is Shaul saying to us that nothing is unclean? What does he mean by that? So Shaul is saying that some people see everything in a sense of holy and elevated versus common or defiled or just ordinary. But he says, but I am convinced that in Yeshua there is nothing unholy in and of itself. Again, he's speaking of context. If you think that he's talking about the shrimp is okay, that's not what he's saying. Read his words in context. What he's saying is that if Yeshua sanctifies that or somebody, he makes that or someone acceptable. Yet for people who continue to consider things common and defiled, they are. He's given us a little bit of leverage to judge these things or use our common sense. Why? Because the world that they live in is a very different world from you and I. Thank goodness I don't have to worry about, meat served to me being, coming from the altar of Zeus or Aphrodite. I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about things that being put on my plate that have previously just sat in front of some idol. I don't have to worry about these things. But they lived in a much, much more complicated world, is what I want you to realize, especially in Rome. Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about a city of many gods and many religions, and they're prevalent, and Judaism is not the main one. We are just a tiny little blurb of weird, bearded looking people sitting out there in the middle of the river. Yes, sir.
So, reading this right now, what it brought to my mind was Peter's dream about eating with Gentiles.
Yes.
And I think you can correct me if I'm mistaken, that the qualifications of holy versus common would have applied then as well, because then as well, we weren't talking about the animals that were prohibited in Leviticus at all.
Right.
And also that the ability to eat with Gentiles, especially believing Gentiles, is a uniting factor. It is placing love first and placing togetherness and community first.
Yes. And it was a dividing factor in the Jewish community where people did not accept Gentiles as equal standing. Remember what Shaul is saying is that we're in Messiah, we have a certain unity that unites us. But remember, not everyone accepts this idea. And so outside of the Messianic Jewish community, that idea would have been rejected. And the idea of eating with Gentiles would absolutely horrify people. Why? Because it comes with a whole lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of baggage. There was no such thing as a Gentile who was, a good one. Let's put it this way. Every single one was an idolater. Mm-hmm. You could pretty much know that. That was going to be the default. So yeah, you're not just talking about eating with somebody who's not Jewish and goes to church and worships one God and all of that and follows the Ten Commandments. You're talking about eating with somebody pagan who prays to foreign gods all the time. And then you're going to be sharing a meal with them, which is, in the ancient world, that's kind of an intimate thing to do. And so there's a lot of barriers in that area, cultural barriers that are very, very strong. And so yes, you're absolutely right to bring that context. We're going to get into that in just a second. That the reason why you're bringing it up is because the same exact language is being used right here in Romans 14 actually is used in the book of Acts. So Shaul stresses that there's a difference in perspective here and opinions over something that is questionable should be given proper respect. Yes, he's being very, generous in saying let people have what they have. Please remember that it's not about kashrut. Please remember that this is not something that even comes up in this chapter. The big assumption that I talked about in my last session, that I tried to dismantle for you, I don't know if I did a good job or not, is that people assume that chapter 14 is about Jewish and Gentile issues. People assume that chapter 14 is about kosher food and non-kosher food, Jewish holidays, non-Jewish holidays, or days that are holy to Jews and days that are ordinary. And I tried to bring it out to you that actually it's not there. We assume that this context is there, but it's not. And I already showed it to you with this whole weak and strong business and people eating everything and people eating only vegetables, and how that, if you're going to follow that logic, it actually falls apart. And so hopefully you remember that. If you don't, we can go back to that at some other point. But so what is unclean and what is unholy? What is common that Shaul is really explaining about? Well, this is one of those terms that simply does not translate. And the reason why I'm giving you multiple translations of this term, because there's really no equivalent for it in English. So this is how different translations will render that same term in Mark 7. Okay, Mark 7, remember the unwashed hands story? Guess what? That's where the word koinos is being used. The disciples eat bread with unwashed or unclean or defiled hands, right? So that word koinos comes up again. And then later on in Acts, we read about Cornelius. And Cornelius is also considered koinos. He's considered to be unclean in what sense? in the sense that he's common, in the sense that he's not sanctified. And to people who treat everything as holy and sanctified, remember what Peter's answer was to the vision. Lord, I have never eaten anything unholy or unclean. He says, I only eat sanctified food. What are you doing offering me these creepy crawlers on the sheet? You know I'm not going to eat this. I mean, that was response. That's why he showed him the vision 3 times. And 3 times Peter said, stop. I'm not eating this. He says, you don't get it. It's not about these creatures. It's about what you're about to do. You're about to go into a house of a Roman centurion whom you consider unclean. So Kepha had to be told otherwise in a vision. That was the point of vision in the passage in Acts that you're familiar with. And Mark 7, is another place where this word koinos comes on. There's several other places. What I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that this term unclean, we assume we know what it means. But we have to understand what it means in context. What kind of unclean are we talking about? That's what he's talking about. So Shaul does mention broma. He mentions food. That's just a generic word for food. Being an obstacle in fellowship, because it was. And people make a leap of logic to assume that Shaul is talking about Jews sticking to vegetables and keeping the Sabbath, while Gentiles eat whatever they want and ignore the fact that some days are special and other days are not. If this is so, my question is, why doesn't he just say so? If this is really how simple it is, why does he just come out and say it? The truth is that these are all very well-known cultural matters. So why does Romans 14 gives us 0 specifics and we have to read between the lines and guess what in the world is he teaching about? I have a guess. And the guess is that is why I think the usual assumptions that people make are wrong. Is because he's not talking about those things. We assume that they're talking about those things because those are the easiest things to assume. That's what makes sense. But why would he be so nondescript? Why would he just come out and say, all right, this is how things are? Yet he creates this very complicated speech and really does not name things as they are. So I have a feeling that this is not what's going on in this chapter at all. Now, if one examines the teachings and the surrounding context closely, it will be hard to be dogmatic about such a leap of logic. And it is a leap of logic to say that Romans 14 is about kashrut, it's about Jews and non-Jews. In fact, you're not going to find any references to Jews in that whole entire section. For all the times that Shaul mentioned Jews and Israel in this letter, just think of how many times in the book of Romans, Shaul says, Judaioi, Jews, right? And how many times does he say Israel? A lot. There's a lot of times that he says that. Now, when we get to this section, he doesn't say it even once. Not once. Does that tell you anything? Maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's about somebody else. So people assume it's about Jews because, they're talking about people with quirky food issues. Well, they got to be Jews. Who else has issues with that? Well, I told you, Romans did. A lot of Romans were vegetarians, religiously vegetarians. So I say we have to assume some of these things. Because we have to assume, if we're going to assume Jews and Gentiles, we have to recognize that it's an assumption. We know that these things separate them. We know that there's issues that are cultural between them, and even though the letter itself actually doesn't say any of that. So we bring our assumptions into the text, and then we use those assumptions to interpret the text. Are we surprised that our interpretations come out exactly the way they come out because we have brought these assumptions into the text? So we make these interpretive assumptions only because the text doesn't actually give us such details. So we come out with what we come out with because of what we have put into the text. We've put a meaning into a text, and that's how we arrive. So it's sort of a mind trick that happens with us. And then we assume that, I figured this out. So let's keep reading. Maybe this will clarify a little bit more for us. Romans 14, 16 through 20. Therefore, do not let what is for you a good thing be spoken as evil. For the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. For the one who serves the Messiah in this way is acceptable to God and approved by other people. Do you remember what he just said about people being acceptable and things being acceptable? In Messiah, Yeshua, things are acceptable. Here he is coming back to it again. So then we pursue the things which make for peace and building up of one another. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are clean. And here he uses the word kathara. So there's that right there. In this case, that's the tahor, the biblical tahor that we're used to. But they are evil, he says, kakon, for the person who eats and causes offense. So Shaul keeps mentioning the things that people eat that are offensive to others, but he does not say what they are or who exactly is offended. Did you notice that? He doesn't say who's offended. He doesn't say what things are. Now, would it be so hard for him to come out and just say it if it is that obvious and it's that simple? But what I'm suggesting to you, it isn't that obvious and it isn't that simple. There's more to these words that people are willing to admit because they want to go to the simplest possible explanation, and it simply does not work. Yes?
If we take Israel out of it, I see it almost like the Messianic movement, and that is we have so many forms of Christianity that come in, and we're arguing amongst ourselves, not about Jewish stuff, but about is it the baptism of the Holy Spirit, is it this or that. So we have a multitude of pagan gods and their positions, who they are, coming in. So we, in a sense, we've got the mixed multitude of many cultural differences coming in, and I don't think we see that in the text because we don't understand, like you said, Roman culture, is that they probably are separated even in their paganism.
They are.
And so the argument falls within themselves over their own cultural that they're bringing in, and it's not, like you said, not a Jewish thing, but a big multitude of pagan worship.
If you're curious to know who is offended and what exactly they're offended by, what is so problematic about some food right here, if you're curious to understand what in the world Shaul is talking about, I'm going to give you my guess. Well, because he doesn't say it flat out, I can't say this is what it is. So this is my guess, this is my interpretation. He's talking about food that is idol related. He's talking about a food that comes from a marketplace. He talked about vegetarians earlier on, and people assume that Jews are the vegetarians, okay? But those are also the same very people that Shaul characterizes as do not care about the days, right? So there are some people who eat vegetables only. Well, guess what? There were Roman cults, Pythagoreans for one, that would not eat any meat at all whatsoever, religiously. That was their big deal. And so others did eat meat. Why? Because they served other deities and they didn't have a problem with that. Plus, meat was cheap. You could get it at the pagan temple for nothing. Why? Because it was already paid for. They were just giving it away. So imagine now, you have in the Roman community some people like that. Then you have other people. Then you have some who are God-fearers. You have a category of Romans who kind of started on a Jewish path and they recognize the laws of Torah and they don't really want to transgress them and they want to be respectful. Yet they come into this mixed gathering of other Romans who bring meat from the idol temple. And these other God-fearers say, I don't want to eat that. I don't want to eat this from the temple of Zeus. I don't want to do that. I know that Jews won't eat it, so I'm with them. I'm not going to eat it either. You can remember, I told you, read Romans 14, read Romans 15. Jews are not involved, they're not mentioned, not by name, not in any kind of way. Later on, we get this little reference to circumcision that comes on, but that whole entire section doesn't have that context. I really do think this is the complexity of a Roman society, of the different types of Romans that are fighting over food, essentially, and disassociating from each other. And Shaul says, as far as I'm concerned, in Yeshua, nothing is unclean. You guys need to stop hassling each other and just eat together the way you were eating together before all of this. Because, by the way, all these laws of kashrut that God gave to Israel, guess what? You would like to honor them, that's okay, but you're pushing it too far because your brother right there across the street, to whom you're related to, by the way, because he is your third cousin's husband, guess what? He's just like you. He's another non-Jew, so he doesn't understand what you understand, perhaps. So if it's to you unclean, yeah, it's unclean to you. He says, don't push it on these people. But if it is clean to them, let them be. Stop hassling them. So there's that sort of say grace that Shaul is asking for people to give. But what I'm suggesting to you is that Jews are not involved in any of this arguments whatsoever. They're not even in this context. People insert this. People insert Jews into this section of Romans, but they're not there. At least I don't see it. So I keep reading and rereading these chapters, and the context just simply does not lend for me to be able to prove it. I can suppose it. I can maybe guess it. I can suggest it. I can intuit it. But I certainly cannot prove to you that Jews were involved in this argument at all. So anyway, if you were curious, I just laid it out for you, what I think the issue might have been.
I mean, this supposing the intention driving the cleanliness of something and being offended and all this kind of stuff, that's exactly how, it's a major component of how vows work. And so if I vow that I'm not going to eat anything, grapes included, all the way down to the raisins and such like this, and then, but I'm imposing on everyone else around me, the intention is what's creating the sin, it's what's creating the defilement, it's what's creating it, and then my person who doesn't have that same vow is free to go as well. It's the same mechanism that you expect in vows.
Exactly. And Jews are, by the way, very much used to this. They're used to saying, you know what, I can't go there. It's all right, I'll sit this one out. But in a community that's different, like this, people are not used to it. They're just used to pushing for their way. Which is why Shaul says, do not put a stumbling block in front of people. They have an issue. They don't want to go there. Why do you force them to? Why do you make them stumble? Why do you want to fight over food? Why do you want to lose peace and fellowship over this issue? Because he says the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking. Do you see? He doesn't really care about the contents. He wants to establish peace. He wants for them to have harmony. He sees that as more important. And that's why he says, all things indeed are clean, but they're evil for the person who eats and causes offense. If you believe that you eating this from the altar of Zeus defiles you, don't eat it. And please, those of you who realize that about that person, don't force them to or trick them to or do that. Because why would you do that to a person? If you have somebody who's a vegetarian over to a dinner at your house, please do not make roast beef. Just don't. Why would you do that to them? You know they're vegetarian. You wouldn't do that in your life. That's what Shaul is saying. Don't treat people like that. Meet them where they are. Respect them. Love them. Yes. Yes, your roast beef is fine. Just not for them because they're vegetarian. You see? That's how these issues could be framed. It's just another way of understanding a text that perhaps I think has been taken into strange directions. Okay. So it's good to eat, not to eat meat, or to drink wine, or to do anything by which your brother or sister stumbles. Now we're not talking about kashrut anymore at all. He says, don't eat meat, don't drink wine, or don't do anything at all that makes your brother stumble. We just gone to non-eating at all. You realize that? Do you understand why this is not about kashrut? This is really about us interacting over food. He says, I just don't eat wine, don't drink wine, don't eat meat, period. The faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is the one who does not condemn himself in what he approves, but the one who doubts is condemned if he eats. Because if his eating is not from faith, then whatever is not from faith is sin. So that's Romans 14, 21 through 23 right there. So we're still left guessing, by the way, because he never told us flat out what he's talking about. Who considers what unclean is not clear. You have to fill in the gaps that the letter actually leaves unspoken. We have to guess. And my guess is it has nothing to do with Jews or kashrut or Jewish holidays, because Shaul leaves it all up to the individuals. This is how I know. You don't have to leave things out for individuals, meaning do whatever you think is right, when you actually have very clear teaching in God's word about these things. There's no point. A rabbi who doesn't lean on the Torah to tell you what Torah says is really not a rabbi. And Shaul was a trained rabbi, so I know that he's not talking about these things. He must be talking about something else. Anyway, that's my inference. That's my guess. Now, suggesting that people should make a judgment call on the issues tells us that the matter is not spelled out in Torah quite clearly. What non-Jews are allowed to eat, for example, is not spelled out in Torah, because Torah is a covenant with Israel and not an instruction book for the nations. You see the problem? Torah does not define actually what non-Jews are allowed or not allowed to eat. Torah is completely silent on that. So if I want to bang my fist on the table and tell you this is how things are, I have nothing to stand on because that issue is not covered. So I have to wonder. So I have to say, okay, we have to make a judgment call here. So he writes, now we who are strong ought to bear the weakness of those without strength, and not just please ourselves. Each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification. For even if Messiah did not please himself, but as is written, the taunts of those who taunt you have fallen on me. So he says, look, Messiah has suffered. He was strong, but he became weak. He chose to submit himself. He allowed himself to be taunted and mistreated. Can you handle a little bit of mistreating yourself, shorting yourself of whatever it is that you consider pleasure? Can you deny yourself a little bit, because Yeshua denied himself quite a bit? So who are the strong and who are the weak is the question. And man, are there some sermons out there that tell you who is who? And I have a hunch that they have it completely reversed. Anyway, I don't know if we want to go into this, the strong and the weak difference. Let's keep reading. Romans 15, 1 through 6. For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction. What is he talking about? He's talking about the scriptures now. He's talking about the Torah. Mm-hmm. Whatever was written was not New Testament, by the way, because it doesn't exist yet. So you know that he's talking about Tanakh. It was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and through encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. Hope. What was written to us, instruction, and we would have hope. Now, may the God who gives us perseverance and encouragement grant you to be of the same mind with one another, according to Messiah Yeshua, so that with one purpose and one voice, you may glorify God and Father of our Master Yeshua Messiah. Do you get the idea what Shaul's letter is all about? Remember I told you that this whole entire long letter is built around the idea of unity in diversity. That you can be different and you can still be on the same page. You could still be together. And this is how he ties up this letter. He's telling you again, whatever was written, it's for our encouragement, for our hope. We need to understand, be instructed, grow in this. But we need to be of the same mind with one another. And he just told you, as a teacher of the Torah, he just explained to you how they can be of the same mind. Stop fighting, stop arguing, stop putting people down and disagreeing over questionable matters of food. Respect each other's opinions and let it stand. Don't put a stumbling block in front of your brother if you know they disagree with you. And stop fighting about it. It just tells you, have one mind, one purpose, one voice, so that together you can glorify God and Father of our Master Yeshua Messiah. Remember, this is what it's about. We don't serve ourselves. We are not here for ourselves. We don't come to this meeting place to benefit ourselves. We do benefit, but it's more of a side effect. We're here to serve Him, Hashem. We're here to glorify Him because we owe it to Him. We owe it to Him. Therefore, accept one another, just as Messiah also accepted us for the glory of God. So remember, Shaul told us earlier in this letter that God loved us when we were sinners, when we were far away from Him. For I say that Messiah has become a servant to the circumcision, so now he's going to bring Jews in, on behalf of the truth of God, to confirm the promises given to the fathers, God made promises. Remember, there's Abrahamic covenant. There's all these long heritage and history that exists, and says Messiah has become a servant, okay, an eved, to the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God to confirm the promises given to the Father. So guess what? The promises given to the Father still stand, according to Shaul, by the way, if anybody was wondering, if those promises were transferred to somebody else. It's still with the circumcision, according to Shaul. And for the Gentiles, he adds on the other part, to glorify God for his mercy, as it is written. So why does he say that? Because, you see, the nations, they stand in God's mercy. God never promised the nations salvation. He never did. He promised it to Abraham. He promised that in Abraham all the nations of the world would be blessed, but he never promised this wonderful thing to the whole world. That's a side effect. That's a benefit that people come into because of God's goodness, because of his love, because of who he is, because of the way that he is. And then what's going to happen next? He says to the Gentiles who glorify God for his mercy, as is written, and he goes, therefore I will give praise among the Gentiles and will sing praises to your name. And then he starts quoting a whole bunch of passages from Tanakh. And that actually is going to go on through a big chunk of chapter 15, where he's going to just keep quoting passage after passage after passage to prove that the nations, they have a place. They have a promise also that is theirs, but theirs is all mercy. It's all benefit, so to say. Israel might have obligations, but the nations, they received a different kind of arrangement. And so in verses 10 through 13, Shaul will go through a panoply of quotations from Tanakh to illustrate what is happening in people's lives today as a reflection of something that the prophets of Israel has foreseen. Shaul is a kind of a Jew who deeply believes in the prophets, so he loves quoting from the prophets, and that's what he's going to do in these verses. And so next, he concludes this long teaching and this long admonition, basically to strive for unity diversity. That's what he tells them. That's really what his conclusion is about. Same thing, my battery's going out there. Romans 15, 14 through 16. Can you believe it? I actually got deep into Romans 15 now. And concerning you, my brothers and your sisters, I myself am also convinced that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and be able also to admonish one another. Meaning, whatever you heard me say, keep repeating it and helping each other out. But I have written very boldly to you on some points, so as to remind you again, because of the grace that was given to me from God, to be a servant of Messiah Yeshua to the Gentiles, ministering as a priest the gospel of God, the good news, so that the offering of the Gentiles may become acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. Now, there's a lot of very interesting content over here. I don't know if I want to go into everything, but basically I want you to see that Shaul is saying, look, you have to get along. I know that you're smart people. You're listening to me. You've gotten to the end of this letter. You might just have what it takes to keep it together because you heard me say all these things. And some of the things I've written to you, well, I've written boldly on some points. And why did I do that? Because I want to remind you why I care. He says, because the grace that was given to me by God to be a servant to the nations, to the Gentiles, ministering as a priest, the gospel of God. Now he gets into allegory now, that he starts comparing himself to the priest. We know that Shaul was not a priest, but he says he compares his ministry to a priestly-like ministry. And guess what he's offering? The offering is the nations. The nations, the Gentiles, are the offering. He's the priest bringing them to God, making them acceptable, making them kadosh, making them a worthy offering before God, which is why he cares about these things, which is why he's been going on about these things, which is why he's been trying to correct their path from error and into a godly kind of character. Remember how much holiness Shaul stressed. Remember earlier on, I told you in this book of Romans that he really is after people living separated, devoted, holy lives. And he went on and on and on, calling them to a higher level of holiness, to a higher level of morality and sanctity than anyone has ever called them in their entire life. He does that in the book. That's what he says. I've written to you some points very boldly. Why? Because I want to present you as an offering, as gifts to God on his altar. That's acceptable, that's sanctified by the Holy Spirit. That's beautiful. Now, you understand it's allegorical, of course. He's using a lot of metaphor here. But that is how he sees himself in a way. And that's why he wrote this letter, and that's why he cares. He tells them. So, though Shaul's teaching is about unity, it is concluded, as long letters can be that way. We will track a few more things, so we will see how he actually closes the letter. So that's going to happen next. I'm not going to be able to do this in this session. Next, just a little preview, Paul will acknowledge all kinds of people by name and tell those who read his letter about his traveling plans and make some promises to visit them. And so the wrap up of his letter is also interesting. So that's what we will do in the next session. But my time is out. Is that fun?